Nathan Caldwell had spent years sculpting his empire from nothing, turning a single startup into a conglomerate that dominated industries across the world. His name commanded respect, his wealth ensured he never heard the word no, and his schedule left no room for nostalgia. Until today. The airport was a chaotic mess of people, all rushing to destinations that mattered only to them. Nathan had just landed in New York on his private jet, stepping into the VIP terminal where luxury was meant to shield him from the disorder of the real world. But today, fate had other plans. At first, it was just a strange sense of déjà vu, like a glitch in the universe. The sound of laughter, light but familiar, rippled through the air. He turned toward the noise, eyes narrowing as they settled on a woman he hadn't seen in 17 years. Sophie Sinclair. Nathan's breath hitched, but before he could fully register the shock, his gaze dropped to the three teenagers surrounding her. And then the world shifted beneath his feet. They weren't just teenagers. They were his reflection in triplicate. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing green eyes, the same unruly dark hair that refused to be tamed. His heart pounded against his ribs, a cold, sharp realization slicing through him. What the hell is happening? Nathan prided himself on control, of his emotions, of his empire, of every situation he stepped into. But this was chaos wrapped in flesh and blood, and it stood right in front of him, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside him. Sophie's eyes widened the moment she saw him, the color draining from her face. For a split second, raw fear flickered in her expression before she masked it with a smile. Too late. He had seen it. Nathan took a step forward, his voice dangerously calm. Sophie. She tensed, gripping the handle of her suitcase a little tighter. Nathan. His gaze flickered to the three teens, 2 boys and a girl. One of the boys, the tallest, was laughing about something, nudging his brother. The girl was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention. His voice caught in his throat. He had spent years mastering boardrooms, dissecting contracts, manipulating billion-dollar deals with his words. Yet now, with one simple observation, he found himself unable to finish a sentence. They're my children. Sophie inhaled sharply but said nothing. Nathan felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest, rage, betrayal, disbelief. You didn't think I had the right to know? His voice was quiet, but the weight of it made Sophie flinch. Sophie swallowed, her fingers tightening around her luggage strap. Not here, Nathan. He clenched his jaw, glancing around. A few people in the lounge were already looking at them. The last thing he needed was his personal life becoming a headline. Fine, he said, his voice clipped. Then let's go somewhere private. Sophie hesitated, glancing at her children. The girl, the one who was clearly their sister, finally looked up from her phone, her gaze bouncing between them with sharp curiosity. Mom? What's going on? Sophie hesitated for a long moment before exhaling softly. Kids, this is Nathan Caldwell. The tall boy raised an eyebrow. The billionaire? Nathan forced a tight smile, his eyes still locked on Sophie. And apparently, much more than that. Sophie exhaled, defeat slipping into her features. We need to talk. Nathan nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets to keep them from shaking. Whatever this was, whatever she had kept from him, he was going to find out. And he wasn't going to walk away without answers. Nathan sat stiffly in the corner booth of an upscale airport cafe, his fingers drumming against the table. The place was quiet, shielded from the public eye, yet tension crackled in the air like a brewing storm. Across from him, Sophie sat with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her eyes downcast. The 3 teenagers had been ushered to another table, close enough to overhear if they wanted to, but far enough that Sophie likely hoped they wouldn't. Nathan, however, had no intentions of keeping his voice down. You're going to start talking now, he said, his voice low but firm. Sophie exhaled, lifting her gaze to meet his. Where do you want me to start? Nathan let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Where do I? Sophie, you hid my children from me. 3 of them. Do you really need me to spell it out? She flinched, guilt flashing in her eyes. I never planned it this way. But you did plan it, he shot back, his voice sharp enough to cut. You made the decision to keep this from me. You chose to walk away and never look back. Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but the taller boy at the other table suddenly spoke up. Okay, can we just acknowledge how weird this is? Nathan turned his gaze toward him. The boy leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I mean, I've seen your face on magazine covers my entire life, and now you're sitting here telling me you're, what? Our dad? He scoffed, shaking his head. This is insane. Nathan's stomach tightened at the word. Dad. A title he'd never held, a role he'd been unknowingly stripped of. Sophie turned to her son, her voice calm but firm. Leo, let me handle this. Leo. Nathan committed the name to memory as he looked at the other 2. The younger boy, slightly shorter than his brother, was staring at him in quiet assessment, while the girl sat still, fingers tapping anxiously on her phone screen. Nathan inhaled deeply before focusing back on Sophie. Tell me everything. No more games. She hesitated, then finally spoke. After we broke up, I found out I was pregnant. At first, I wanted to tell you, but you were already gone, off chasing your dreams, building your empire. I didn't know how to reach you. Nathan's jaw tightened. You didn't know how to reach me? Sophie, my company was on the front page of every business journal. You could have walked into any office with my name on the door, and they would have put you in touch with me. She shook her head. You don't understand, Nathan. It wasn't just about finding you. It was about us. We were toxic back then. You were obsessed with success, and I was terrified of getting swallowed up by your world. If I had told you, you would have tried to be there, but at what cost? Would you have given up everything you worked for? Nathan clenched his fists. You don't get to make that call for me. Sophie exhaled, rubbing her temples. I know. And maybe I was wrong. But at the time, I did what I thought was best for them. Nathan looked at the 3 teens again, his mind spinning. His entire life had been built around control, around calculated risks and flawless execution. Yet here he was, confronted with the one thing he had never even considered, fatherhood. 17 years, he murmured. 17 years, Sophie. Her face softened. I didn't keep them from you out of spite. I kept them from the version of you I knew back then. Nathan stared at her, feeling an ache he couldn't quite name. He had been so focused on his success, so relentless in his pursuit of power, that he had never looked back. Never even questioned what he had left behind. And now, sitting across from him, were the consequences of his absence, 3 living, breathing reminders of a life he never knew existed. The younger boy, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. So, what happens now? Silence hung in the air. Nathan had no answer. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what came next. Nathan had spent years making impossible decisions, but none had ever felt as heavy as this moment. He looked at the 3 teenagers, his children, seated across from him. Leo, the eldest, was staring at him with barely concealed skepticism. The younger boy, whom Sophie had called Theo, studied him more cautiously, his expression unreadable. And the girl, Mia, though silent, had been stealing glances at him with quiet intensity, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that had been missing for too long. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. I need to know something. His voice was steadier than he felt. Do they even know anything about me? Sophie hesitated. I told them enough. Leo scoffed. Right. Enough to make sure we never looked for you. Sophie turned to him, her expression softening. Leo. No. Leo leaned forward, his green eyes flashing. You told us he was someone from your past, that he wasn't a bad guy, but that he wasn't our guy. You made it seem like he wasn't worth knowing. And now, he's sitting here, knowing nothing about us, while we've known his name our entire lives. Nathan's throat tightened. He had lost 17 years, and now, it seemed, he had been erased from them as well. Theo crossed his arms. So, are you here because you suddenly care? Or just because you got caught? The words stung more than Nathan cared to admit. He looked at Sophie, who was watching him carefully, waiting to see how he would respond. For the first time, Nathan wasn't speaking as a billionaire, a mogul, or a man in control. He was speaking as something entirely foreign to him, a father. I don't have an excuse, he said finally, his voice raw. I didn't know you existed. I can't change that, and I won't insult you by pretending I can make up for it overnight. But I'm here now, and if you'll let me, I want to know you. The table went silent. Leo leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression unreadable. And what if we don't want that? Nathan swallowed hard. He hadn't considered that possibility, that they might not want anything to do with him. Sophie finally spoke. That's not fair, Leo. No, Nathan cut in. It is fair. He turned back to his son. You have every right to be angry. But I'm not asking for a perfect ending. I just want a chance. Theo's brow furrowed. A chance for what? Nathan hesitated. What was he asking for? A chance to make things right? To be the father they never had? To fix something broken beyond repair? I don't know, he admitted. But I'm willing to find out. Maya, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. You know what's crazy? Nathan turned to her, waiting. She tapped her fingers on the table. For all your money and power, you look just as lost as we feel. Nathan let out a soft, breathless laugh. That's because I am. A pause. Then, surprisingly, Maya smiled, small but genuine. Theo sighed. Well, I guess we should at least hear you out. Nathan nodded, something like hope flickering in his chest. That's all I'm asking. Sophie exhaled, looking between them. This isn't going to be easy. Nathan met her gaze. Nothing worth having ever is. For the first time, Sophie smiled. Nathan had built an empire from nothing. He had conquered the world. But sitting here, in a quiet airport cafe, surrounded by the family he never knew he had. This was the only legacy that ever truly mattered. If you liked it, subscribe to the channel and enjoy these other amazing stories.